and you can take it away.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here at our monthly War Industry Resistors Network webinar. I think this is number 23. It might be 24. I've lost track, but we do one every month. And this evening's is about the run up to war with China. And we're really honored and pleased to have KJ No with us as our presenter. As usual, before we start with our presenter, and I'll give a little intro to KJ before we go, I'd like to introduce Paul Shannon to tell us a little bit about WERN and what we're doing and how you can be part of things. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you, Ken. Welcome, everyone. We are the War Industry Resistors Network. And we're a network of groups around the country who have as our goal taking our country back from military contractors, who, together with the fossil fuel barons, are bringing our country and our world to ruin. The growing power of military contractors over our lives is becoming clearer each day. Our webinars have exposed how these merchants of death drive our foreign policy and shape our culture to make what they do seem normal. By documenting their influence over key think tanks, our universities, our media, our nonprofit world, as well as over the U.S. Congress and the executive branch, we expose the sources of their power and bring these connections out into the open. We urge you to look at the recordings of these amazing past webinars. They can be found on our website link, to which I am going to try to put on our website page, I should say, which I'm going to try to put a link to that page.
Just did it, Paul.
Okay, thanks. That should be in the chat then. Each group in our loose network focuses on one or more military contractors operating in its community. In fact, with the horrendous situation in Gaza right now, we urge all the groups in our network to consider an action at your local war contractor that is providing components for the weapons being used against Gaza at this very moment. Our Raytheon campaign in Massachusetts and Ken's in Asheville did just that this week and got a tremendous response from the public. If you need documentation about the links of your local war contractor to the war in Gaza, let us know and we'll see if we can help. In fact, we hope to plan a coordinated week of action of all our groups focused on military contractors connected to the war sometime in December. And we're hoping that everyone will participate. We also want to call your attention to our next webinar, which will be very, very important, with Jeff Halper, who will show us how Israel has carved out a niche in the global military complex and how it markets and sells its products and services as having been field tested in Palestine. Jeff Halper is an Israeli-American anthropologist, author, lecturer, and political activist who has lived in Israel since 1973. He is the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions and a co-founder of the One Democratic State campaign. Jeff will be speaking to us from Jerusalem. That's December 6th. Because of the difference in time zones, that webinar will take place at 4 o'clock Eastern time, as opposed to our regular slot in the evenings. But tonight we will learn about how we are being mobilized for war with China and how military contractors benefit from this militarization of our society. We want to thank KG No for being with us to share his research and his insights. So Ken, let us begin.
All right, thanks so much, Paul. So I'm going to give KJ a little intro here, and then KJ is going to take it over. And after he finishes his presentation, we're going to have a little call to action, as we have been doing for the past few webinars. And then we'll have Q&A. And I just want to give you a heads up about the Q&A. In the most recent webinars, we've had people raise their hand, like with the reaction button, raise your hand, and then we line you up and we take one after the other. We're going to try this evening to do something different, and that is, as we go along, if you have a question, you put it in the chat. And Brian and Paul will be looking at the chat and getting those questions so we can get them on the spot, and then we'll be ready to go when KJ is ready for Q&A. So put your questions in the chat, and we won't do the raised hand feature this evening. Okay, let me tell you about KJ. He is a political scientist, an educator, and a journalist, focusing on the geopolitics and political economy of the Asia Pacific. He's written for Dissident Voice, Black Agenda Report, Asia Times, Counterpunch, LA Progressive, MR Online, and People's Daily. He also does frequent commentary and analysis on various news programs, including The Critical Hour, By Any Means Necessary, and Breakthrough News. He recently co-authored a study on the military transmission of infectious diseases and its implications for COVID transmission. So, KJ, over to you. Thanks for coming and thanks for your presentation.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be with you and all the participants here. Mindful of time, I would like to jump right into my presentation, and then hopefully we will have time for ample question and answer and perhaps even debate. So okay, so I want to talk about the US war on China, and in particular, how it's happening, why it's happening, who is involved. But before that, I want to just kind of state the blindingly obvious, and please forgive me for doing so, but just to kind of reinforce what we already know, that the business of the United States is war. That is to say, in its 240 plus years of history, there are only 16 years in which the US has not been at war. And since World War II to 2001, the US has initiated 201 out of the 248 armed conflicts in 153 regions and locations. That is to say, it has instigated 80% of the total wars fought. It has invaded 84 countries and has been militarily involved in 191. And you can look this up on the Congressional Research Service. There's a 50-page list. It has, even if we, disregard war, it has interfered in 86 foreign elections, overthrown 36 governments, attempted to assassinate over 50 foreign leaders, and it has American special forces in about 2/3 of the world's countries, and bases in about 3/4 of them. And so I think it goes without a doubt that the US is so deeply embedded and so deeply committed to war that this is one of the key sources of suffering and distress and disorder on this planet. And so US President Jimmy Carter said the US is the most warlike nation in the history of the world. Paul Atwood says war is the American way of life. And of course, we all know Martin Luther King, who said that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And these are some of the words which got him killed. But pivoting a little bit right now, I think it's really important for us to just for a moment highlight what's going on in Gaza. The US is underwriting the genocide in Gaza right now as we speak. And, this is the, this is the US doctrine. We think it's worth it. Madeleine Albright, when the Pentagon was asked if the US will put any limits on Israel's use of US provided weapons, their response was, we are not putting any limits on how Israel uses weapons. That is really up to the IDF. We're not putting any constraints on that, which is another way of saying we greenlight genocide. So, as a poet once said, we are heading into a murderous time. And these are some statements from Gazans. These are some of the last statements of Gazans who have said, tell others that we are the bearers of truth. If we die, know that we are content and steadfast, and tell others we are the bearers of truth. Palestine, from the river to the sea. So I think it's really, really important for us. I think this highlights for us more than ever what our task is and what is going on and what is at stake. And I was going to save this for last, but I just wanted to name some names because I think it's important to name them. There's CNAS, Center for the New American Security, which is essentially the reconstituted neocons. It's PNAC, Project for a New American Security. It's practically a rhyming. It's practically a rhyme of PNAC, and then there's also West Exec Advisors. This was founded by Michelle Flournoy and Anthony Blinken. It's about fast-tracking tech and military procurement. If you go onto West Exec Advisors website, you will see that Anthony Blinken has been stricken from the record. It's just Michelle Flournoy and two other people that they've added to the website. But we know that Anthony Blinken, it's on record that Anthony Blinken is the co-founder of West Exec. So this is the revolving door. Just a quick update. These are the people of the Center for a New American Security in the Biden administration. You can see that there are a lot of heavy hitters here, among them Eli Ratner, Kurt Campbell, Victoria Nuland, etc. And then you can see also that they have an obsession about China. Eli Ratner says everything must be oriented around China. Kurt Campbell, who is the co-founder of CNAS, is the architect of the pivot to Asia. We also know Flournoy, Nuland, and the other thing to remember about CNAS is they were responsible for the Afghan debacle, the Afghan strategy of counterinsurgency, which was all the rage in all the military services. That was their doctrine. They own Afghanistan, and now they are owning China. Once again, West Exec Advisors, essentially, this is Michelle Flournoy and Tony Blinken's gravy train. And once again, very powerful example of the revolving door. Now, the thing that I want to point out, which I always point out, is the US is already at war with China. And what I mean by that is that war is not simply shooting war, kinetic war. There is a build up to war. It's a kind of a multi-dimensional process. And we refer to this as hybrid war. And we are already far into that process. And it starts out on the earliest level with manufacturing consent. You can see the key earmarks, which is hyper demonization of the country and the population to be attacked. And then you will also see suppression of peace and anti-war movements. And most recently, we saw this in the New York Times attack on Code Pink and other anti-war peace organizations. Just as before the infantry goes in, air goes in and suppresses all the defenses, and they create a no-fly zone. Before kinetic war starts, the media and the propaganda apparatus goes in, and it suppresses all critical thinking, all anti-war movements, all peace movements, and it essentially creates a no critical thinking zone. And that's where we're at right now. And then, of course, the third signal is that there is an incredible escalation in domestic attacks on the local community. That is to say, we have seen a multifold increase on Asians in the United States. And this is simply because when you start to demonize a country on the level that is necessary for mass war, then some of that wholesale demonization blows back into retail violence. If you prepare to attack people over there, it will also blow back, and people here will be attacked as well. And so these are some of the key signals that we can note, which lets us know that the United States is very, very close to war. Now, this is not to say that everything is a continual escalation. You'll see that there's a pendulation or a ratcheting effect. So you'll see, 3 steps forward and then maybe 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 1 step back. You'll see mixed messages, you'll see the beatings and then you'll see the flowers. It's this kind of, it's almost like a domestic violence type of a dynamic. It's Jekyll and Hyde. It's good cop, bad cop. But if you look at the long pattern, you will see that it is a continual escalation to war. So one of the key things we have to note is information war. So information war always precedes the shooting war. In fact, it's what enables the shooting war, and it continues during the war. It's a constant process. And so we can see, if we think of hybrid warfare, of having multiple dimensions, there's economic, military, irregular, support of local unrest, propaganda, information warfare, cyber attacks, etc., you'll see that we're clearly in this information warfare dimension. And of course, the language also matters, because before countries go to war, the words go to war, the language goes to war, the language of genocide, of threat, of empathy, all of these things become part of the equation. And this is where the US has an extraordinary strength. The US has an extraordinary capacity for information warfare, not simply because it monopolizes the media and the means of production and dissemination, but because it has a century of advertising and public relations. The empire knows how to sell war as a product. And there's several dimensions of this. One is what's called the fire hose of falsehoods. This is Rand's study. Essentially, you're just constantly barraged with lies. But there's a hack in the mind that if you keep on hearing something over and over and over again, and you hear it from multiple channels, you start to believe that it's right and correct. It's almost like if you see something which is misspelled, but everybody misspells it, then after a while you start to accept it as correct. And this is how the fire hose of falsehood works. And then, of course, there's all this projection going on. And I just want us always to think that when the US accuses a country of something, it's usually a confession. So as I said, before soldiers go to war, language goes to war. And we can look at specific language or words that have been co-opted or reframed or redefined in very, very specific ways. I'll just go over a few of them. And then if people are interested, we can go in more detail. But essentially, the US has many asymmetric advantages. And in the war of words, human rights, democracy, social credit score, labor rights, all of these words will be weaponized. Security, shared values, independence, etc. And so we really have to notice and be aware of the ways in which language has gone to war and is being adulterated. Essentially, in hybrid war, the US understands that space is a dimension of war, space in the sense of outer space, but also cyberspace, and also mental space. Your minds or your mental space are being occupied and colonized as we speak, as war is being waged. So rules-based international order is one of these terms. It's simply a euphemism for US hegemonic order. A threat means a country that does not subordinate itself to US hegemony or to the hegemony of US allies. Therefore, the Palestinians are a threat. Autocratic means a country which is not submissive to the United States. Democratic is usually a term that is applied to subservient client states. Anti-access area denial, which you will see constantly related to China, just means defense. China has capacity to defend itself. But when you say that China's defensive capacities are a threat to the United States, that doesn't make sense. So you use this jargon, anti-access area denial. And it's also tied into this notion of access. That somehow that the United States should have access to everywhere and everything and everyone, and that it's frustrated and threatened when it's denied. And so there's a very kind of sexual dimension to this. Freedom of navigation operation is simply a show of force. The US is always doing these in the South China Sea. Revisionist power is a euphemism for official enemy. When a country is called a revisionist power, it means major official enemy. Competition, the US likes to use the word competition when it's talking about China, but what it really means is that it is at war, at hybrid war with China. And when it says that it's looking to both compete and cooperate, this is the Jekyll and Hyde, good cop, bad cop, counterinsurgency policy that it has towards China and its enemies. It's essentially the doctrine where, counterinsurgency troops will play soccer and hand out soccer balls during the day, and then they'll kick down your door and shoot you or kidnap you at night. It's good cop, bad cop. It's the kind of rough sex analogy to political affairs. Containment is simply another word for rollback or even regime change. Allies are another word for vassals, client states. Genocide in certain contexts regarding China refers to the program of human development. And at the same time, it becomes completely forbidden when it is actually happening, as we are seeing right now before our eyes in Palestine. To zent something means to exaggerate something by a factor of 1,000 or more, to create fraudulent imaginary statistics and data. It's a reference to Adrian Zentz. Security means imperial interests. Shared liberal values are settler colonial white supremacist values. And often you'll hear reference to the international community, which is not international and it's not a community. It refers to the Western Atlantic capitalist colonial states. Independence is also abused. And also all of this, it's constant information warfare. It's the capture of language before the capture of territory. It's the capture of minds before the capture of sovereign states and global domination. So I just want to once again reiterate that, as Orwell said, this is a time of total deceit. Every war, when it comes, is represented as an act of self-defense against a homicidal maniac. And William Casey said, and he put it best, he said, our disinformation program will be complete when everything the American public believes is false. So coming to China, this is a map which I think is important to note. Essentially, you can see that China is encircled with US bases, which leads to the question, how come they put their territory so close to our bases? Of course, it's the US which is doing the encircling. There are somewhere between 330 to 400 bases, depending on how you count the bases. But what's extraordinary is that it is a complete and total encirclement going along the first island chain, the second island chain, the third island chain, and all the way through the Pacific and along land corridors as well. Here you can see some of the bases. Once again, Okinawa, Korea, many areas, Guam, are simply groaning from the weight of US military force. You can see that there's a very clear arc of containment. It's a very deliberate containment, and it has multiple layers and multiple boundaries involved, and going all the way down to Australia. Here is the island chain that you can actually see. There's some very deep calibration in terms of the range of what the US expects China can defend against. And then the design is to disperse that as much as possible, to act from long-range standoff distances, but also to disperse attacks as much as possible in order to overwhelm China. Just a quick parenthetical note. This doctrine of war is called air-sea battle. And I'll go a little bit more into that, but it comes out of air-land battle, which was the US doctrine of war against the Soviet Union. And air-land battle comes out of the Yom Kippur War. So we'll go over all of that history, but I think that is also important. So clearly Biden is preparing for war with China. It's not if, but how. And there are different theories about this, different factions, but the answer is we go to war. Real men go to war with China. And the question is it going to be ambidextrous? Is it going to be sequential? Or is it going to be directly focused? Kurt Campbell believes that we should wage a two-front war, ambidextrous. Others believe that you go to China through Russia, that is, you wipe out and degrade Russia first. That way you get an overland route to China, as well as a Pacific encirclement. And then other people say that, leave Russia to the Europeans. Everything must be focused on China. And this is Eli Ratner. And then there's the search for casus belli. So as I said, the doctrine of war against China is called air-sea battle. It's been renamed. They've given it another acronym, but it's essentially air-sea battle. It was published to the public in 2013, but it was actually developed around 2009. And that was right after the global economic collapse. And those two are intimately connected. It was about 2.5 years before the declaration of the pivot to Asia, which was the plan to encircle China. And essentially, it is a battle doctrine which has to do with long-range standoff, precision strike. It has subsurface attacks. It's networked warfare, including space warfare. It's automated warfare. It's hybrid warfare, energy weapons. It is incredibly complex, and it is incredibly belligerent. As I said, it comes out of the air-land battle doctrine, which was the doctrine of war against the USSR in Europe. And air-land doctrine was essentially developed out of the Yom Kippur War. As I said, it's about a very, very aggressive doctrine that it's you take the fight to the enemy and you attack in depth, far deeply inside their territory with agility, and you constantly take the aggressive. It's a very, very aggressive form of war. It's what they call deep battle extended in space, far into the enemy's territory, into its center, and also in time. It involves a lot of new technology, in particular guided weapons and missiles. And it's all about multi-domain joint operations warfare. It was applied in the Gulf War. It was applied in Kosovo. It was applied in all US wars. And it was developed by the Training and Doctrine Center of the US military after the Yom Kippur War. That war, if you recall, was essentially, in a foundational sense, it was a proxy war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Both sides were using US weapons versus Soviet weapons, and it was also a challenge of US war doctrine versus Soviet war doctrine. And what is clear is that the US opponents came out ahead, and this created a huge shock. And one of the ways that the initiative was recaptured was by just this incredible bombing campaign deep inside, the U.S. opponent's territory, and that became the foundation of air-land battle, which has been translated into air-sea battle. Related to air-land battle and air-sea battle is the notion of the third offset, which involves autonomous warfare. That is, you're using machines to wage war, AI warfare. And these autonomous machines are also networked. And the idea behind this networking is that you want to disperse your attacks. You want to diffuse, you want to swarm your attacks in order to overwhelm defenses. It also involves subsurface and, as I said, long-range standoff warfare. It is multi-domain, full-spectrum hybrid warfare. This is just an example of this kind of networked warfare. As I said, this believes that all domains of war have to be contested, not only land and sea, but subsurface and cyberspace, air and space. And also the use both of hard and soft power, conventional and non-conventional operations, state and non-state actors to wage war. This is a doctrine, this is a study by the RAND Corporation called Thinking Through the Unthinkable. If I'm not mistaken, it was published in 2015, not long, about 3 years after the pivot was declared. And essentially, they're working out how to wage war with China. One of the things that they highlight is that China's key vulnerability is its trade routes through the South China Sea. $5.3 trillion worth of China's external trade, and 77% of China's fuel goes through the South China Sea. So if the US were to wage war against China in the South China Sea, that is, for example, near the Philippines, the US doesn't have to win this war. The war simply has to happen. And that will put such an extraordinary disruption to China's trade that China's economy could reduce by about 30%. But RAND Corporation says that this has to happen before 2025. So the idea is to create a shock to trade. They estimate that the US doesn't have to win. The disruption to the United States would be very minimal. Well, minimal in the sense that they still think it's worth it. US GDP would fall by 5 to 10%. China's GDP would fall by 25 to 35%. And then they anticipate that that could create a significant internal unrest. Combine that with separatist activities, which would create a cycle of repression, and then you're setting the China up for essentially collapse. Anyway, Rand suggests the United States should make prudent preparations to be able to wage a long and intense war with China. Rand was commissioned to do this study by the military. South Korea is also going to be a very, very important part of this. South Korea is the sixth most powerful military on the planet, 625,000 service members and 3 million in reserve. And the United States has operational control over all South Korean troops when it matters, that is, during war. The moment the US declares war, it gets about 3.7 million troops for free. That's free cannon fodder, which is an extraordinary moral hazard. This is an example. This is Curtis Scaparotti, and this is a Korean lawmaker. If we pan out, you can see that the Korean lawmaker is giving a piggyback ride to the United States commander-in-chief. South Korea is essentially a client state. And you can see that the current administration is essentially doing everything that the United States wants in terms of escalating to war. Essentially, it's given the United States belligerent, aggressive foreign policy back to the US on a silver platter. In particular, escalation with China on all dimensions, including destroying their own semiconductor industry. Samsung is, I think it's lost something like 80% of its profits since it's been forced to go along with US sanctions on China on semiconductors. And so, you know, this kind of continual escalation, this continual obeisance, this continual corralling of clients in order to do the bidding of the United States is definitely part of this. The Philippines is also involved. As I said, the Philippines is a potential key belligerent in the South China Sea, which I said was one of the key choke points. And essentially, the US has reaffirmed that they have a mutual defense treaty and that an armed attack in the Pacific would be considered to be a potential act of war against the United States, that the US would be obligated to defend the Philippines. And you see the constant escalations between ships and these islands that are contested by 4 or 5 different countries. These islands, or they're not even islands, they're really just coral reefs, but they're contested or claimed by 4 or 5 different countries. But the US only highlights the conflict between China and its proxy, the Philippines, and is using that, or maybe using that, as a casus belli. Certainly it's a provocation. So as Blinken said, we reaffirmed an armed attack on a Philippine armed forces, public vessels or aircraft in the South China Sea would invoke US mutual defense commitments under Article 4. Taiwan is also a key point of escalation. As you know, the global consensus is that there is only one China, and Taiwan Island is part of China. And that's true not only for the United Nations, it is the global consensus, and it is also true for the Republic of China, that is to say, Taiwan's own constitution. They only recognize one China. And I'll also point out that the PRC wants peaceful reunification, but The US is consistently provoking China, and it's essentially creating an intolerable situation. Most notably, the US passed inside the NDAA, the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, which is essentially a plan to turn Taiwan into a second Ukraine. That is to say, turn it into an armed madhouse. They're currently micromanaging the Taiwanese military, and they have plans to micromanage the Taiwan government. And it is really, really an intolerable provocation. The Chinese see the people of Taiwan as simply the people from Fujian province. They speak the same language as Fujian. It is a region of China. But just as if we think of, you have a family and you have a family member who is locking themselves in their room, you might tolerate that, and you might make sure that, they get food and are taken care of. And you might tolerate that for a while. But if that family member starts to stockpile weapons in their room and starts to fill their room with gasoline and explosives, then the question becomes, how long can this be allowed to continue before some kind of disarming has to happen? That's essentially the situation with Taiwan Island. And the US is deliberately provoking this. It's planning to turn Taiwan Island into a Ukraine. So as I said, the fat is smoking in the pan. One of the earmarks is that when you see random rage killings of people over here, it means that mass killing of people over there is acceptable. And we've seen these epidemic of attacks against Asians. I won't go into them except to point out that they escalated after Trump left. This is just in New York City, but after Trump left and Biden came in, you saw a multifold increase in attacks on Asians. So we can't lay this on Trump. They're also happening outside of the Trumposphere. They're happening all over Western countries. These are defiled Buddhas in Canada. So you can't separate these attacks on Asians from the warmongering on China. When you have a wholesale policy of hate mongering, it trickles down into retail violence. You're going to get that kind of collateral damage. And it's constant. And of course, the lies come hard and fast and thick. China's committing genocide, although they've never shown any proof. And we can see what a genocide looks like when it happens before our eyes. China's responsible for COVID, have stolen our jobs, etc. This constant escalation of hybrid war. Just to kind of go over some of the different dimensions, there's economic and, of course, financial warfare. This is the decoupling, the trade war, the sanctions, what they refer to euphemistically as de-risking, high fences and small gardens. But essentially, it's a plan to decouple and remove China from the global economy. There's various types of tech war, the most recent, which is the CHIPS Act, which is essentially a plan to prevent China from developing its semiconductor industry any further. Essentially, the US is saying, China, that's enough. You are no longer going to develop, which is another way of saying that, you are consigned to, wherever and whatever we deem is acceptable. There's all kinds of legal warfare. If you look them up, you'll see that there are about 3 anti-China bills passed in Congress, not passed, but proposed in Congress every single day. It's as if our entire Congress is spending all its time focused on China. Can you imagine if we had 1,000 bills for single-payer health insurance? I mean, this would be, it would be a completely different, but you can see where the emphasis is. We also saw the kidnapping of Huawei's executive. And of course, I should point out that Nancy Pelosi meets every 10 days with a lobbyist from Taiwan. But if you as a constituent, as am I, were to try to get a meeting with her, not once in 10 years would she even deign to, meet with you, for 5 seconds, although she meets every 10 days with lobbyists from Taiwan. There's also diplomatic warfare, there's military brinksmanship, as I've spoken about. They're installing missiles on Yonaguni Island, which is, within striking distance of Taiwan and China. Most recently, the US has been flying B-52 flights just off the coast of China. These are strategic nuclear bombers that are potentially carrying nuclear cruise missiles, and it's just flying them blithely right up to China's doorstep. If that isn't provocation, I don't know what is. And of course, when China reacts to this, then the allegation is China is inappropriately intercepting U.S. Legal flights. There's all the civil subversion, everything you saw about Hong Kong that was one long color revolution, one long information war. And then you see all kinds of support for anti-government activities. We also know the academic warfare that has been happening. It's ongoing, it's on and on. There's actually no end to it. It's really quite extraordinary. Just a quick, just to go over why is the US at war with China. To be simple, it has to do with Martin Luther King's 3 evils. It's militarism, materialism, and racism, or I think more accurately, empire, capitalism, and racism. The US has a long history of aggression against China and the Chinese. The past is not even past, it is actually the present. The US has a long history of race war, considered Chinese filthy yellow hordes that should be lynched. The greatest lynchings of people in the United States was of Chinese. And we have the term a Chinaman's chance, which means that you could be subject to death at a whim, on the whim of a white person. And the historical record shows that very, very clearly. We also see this has been expanded to other Asian communities, and Japanese internment is one of them. But the key trigger point, and this is where we'll come back to over and over again, was in 1949 when China liberated itself. It became, the People's Republic, and that unleashed what we refer to as McCarthyism, with the refrain, "Who lost China?" And the rollback of that, or the reaction to that, was 2 genocidal hot wars, that is to say, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and then several counterinsurgencies, of which the absolute worst was what happened in Indonesia, essentially the Jakarta method, the politicide of between 1 to 2 million left-leaning people in Indonesia. And so anyway, during the Nixon era, there was a kind of a détente with China to counterbalance against the USSR. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was no need to do that. And the neocons became worried that China could become a challenger to the United States itself. So even back as far back as the 1990s and in the early 2000s, there was a group inside the United States that was starting to escalate to war with China. There's a very kind of clear pattern or series of events that led to the current moment. It starts with the Defense Planning Guidance document, also known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. This was this kind of hubristic declaration of the US unipolar moment, written by Paul Wolfowitz, among others. It's sometimes referred to as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. This becomes the project for a new American century, which is then incorporated into the Bush Doctrine and the wars in the Middle East. And then that becomes also part of the Obama doctrine, which involves the pivot to Asia, air-sea battle, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then this is inherited and enhanced in the Trump doctrine with the national security strategy and the national defense strategy and the beginning of a very aggressive trade war. And now the Biden administration has simply continued this in its Indo-Pacific strategy, which is essentially the Pacific pivot on steroids, the IPEF, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership on steroids. And it's also underwritten by the third and the fourth offsets. Some of the key figures involved is Andrew Marshall. He was the model for Dr. Strangelove. And he ran the Office of Net Assessment inside the Pentagon. He was the top advisor to 12 secretaries of state. And he had two obsessions. One was defeating the Soviet Union and preventing China's rise to power. These are some of the people who studied under him. They're referred to as St. Andrew's Prep School, or the Church of St. Andrew. That's Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Cohen, Krapinovich, Pillsbury, Herman Kahn, Richard Pearl. I think you know their faces and their names. And then you also had the Blue Team members who intermingled with the Marshall's proteges. These are the other neocons. That's Michael Ledeen, that's John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, Newland, Nancy Pelosi. All of these were deeply, deeply interconnected. One of the important people is Andrew Krapinovich. He actually wrote out the nuts and bolts of war with China. He's the architect of air-sea battle. Michael Pillsbury was the China czar under Donald Trump. He was responsible, actually, for the weaponization of the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. And then he became an anti-China hawk and wrote about China's belligerence towards the US and how they were preparing a 100-year marathon against the US. This is Pompeo, who is very close to, quote unquote, the Committee on the Present Danger. Essentially, this is Frank Gaffney's group, which is simply recycling the 1950s Cold War institution, the Committee on the Present Danger. And they're saying that there is no hope of coexistence with China. Once again, here are the people. Here are their faces and their names. Defense planning guidance doctrine document is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival. This is the pivot. It was architected by Kurt Campbell from CNAS, and it was declared by Hillary Clinton. So this is how this came about. There are many, many layers to this. All of this is to say that essentially they see China as an irreconcilable and mortal threat. Nancy Pelosi has been very, very important here. They have done almost everything they can to saturate Congress with an unending stream of litigation and legislation against China. They've essentially institutionalized China bashing. There's a little bit of geopolitical theory behind this. It has to do with something called the Heartland theory, which feeds into all of these subsequent theories. And you can also understand it from an ideological perspective as well. The offset strategies have to do with the strategic dimensions of war. First offset is mass, simply bigger, more powerful. If you have a more powerful bomb, you defeat your enemy. The second offset is precision. If you have a precise weapon, you can destroy your enemy's big weapons before they can get them off. And if both parties have precision weapons, then what you do is you disperse your weapons and you automate your warfare so that even if they strike 1 or 2 or 100, there's so much dispersion that you can still overwhelm them. So the third offset is what is in play right now. It's what is in play with this encirclement. As I said, Taiwan is part of this chiastic history. It was stolen from China and became a Japanese colony. It should have reverted to China at the end of World War II, but instead, by force of the United States, it was kept as a US paracolony because it was geostrategically critical, what they referred to as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And then the United States has continually escalated against China using Taiwan and the Taiwan Policy Act and the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act as a way to wage lawfare that provokes war against China. Geostrategically, you can see how it encloses several key channels that locks China in. This is the view from Jinmen Island, which is part of Taiwan Island. It's 3 kilometers away from China. You could swim to China from this island on Taiwan province. So Joe Biden has said strategic ambiguity over Taiwan is over. Essentially, if Joe Biden has said we will go to war over Taiwan. The Taiwan Policy Act is legislation. If you look at that, you can see it's a bill to support the security of Taiwan and its right of self-determination. Absolute absurdity. If you can imagine the Chinese passed a bill ensuring the right of self-determination of Texas or California or any other part of the United States, the US would see it as an act of war. This Taiwan Policy Act speaks about the right of self-determination and placing an enduring rotational presence on Taiwan Island. Enduring rotational presence means military base. The Taiwan Policy Act was turned into the NDAA, and it was turned into TERRA, Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, and then it was snuck in through the NDAA. And essentially, you can see it's preparation for interoperability, joint operations, partnership between the militaries, train future leaders of Taiwan, et cetera, enduring rotational military presence. And then there's a micromanagement of its weaponry, long-range fires, anti-ship cruise missiles, undersea warfare, manned, unmanned aerial systems, command and control, cyber warfare. And then it's also a micromanagement of Taiwan's civil society. They want to assess what Taiwan is doing in order to Ukrainize its population. Do they have enough manpower? Are they boosting civilian defenses? Are they making sure that all civil dimensions of the country and its population are ready for war? This is U.S. legislation on Taiwan. Essentially, CSIS, one of these warhawk think tanks from which CNAS came out of, said, essentially, prepare for war, prepare for sanctions, prepare covert and clandestine operations of hybrid war. That is to say, regardless of what happens, we can argue that the threshold has already been met. We don't have to invoke the Taiwan Relations Act. We should have the mechanisms in place for immediate crisis response, including options for covert and clandestine operations in space, cyber, undersea domains. CNAS, as again, the warhawk think tank, essentially they believe that that war is an inevitability, that we essentially can no longer shape China. We have to be ready for war. Eli Ratner and also Elbridge Colby are some of the key thinkers about how to provoke war, especially Colby over Taiwan. And so essentially, he has a book out. It's very, very detailed, essentially, how to wage war, how to provoke war. China must be provoked into initiating the escalation so that it will appear to be the aggressor. And then we have Japan, Korea, US trilateral alliance. This is a brokered forced wedding because the US wants to use the different powers of both Japanese Navy and the South Korean military in order to escalate to war. They want a lot of the fighting, as much of the fighting, to be done by proxies as possible. This is a topologist map of the world. This will explain to you why China is so important. What you see here is Eurasia is the top 2/3. The bottom 1/3 is the Americas. And you can see that Eurasia is interconnected through land everywhere. China has more borders than any other country in the world. And if China were to unify, or if the Eurasian continent were to unify, that is to say Russia, Iran, and China, along with other countries, it would become the most powerful region on the planet, certainly the richest region on the planet, and it would lock out the United States from control over the entire planet. And so this is one of the reasons why the US wants to control China, wage war against China, wage war in Eurasia and East Asia. The term for this is Halford Mackinder, an Oxford geographer, referred to it as the pivot area or the pivot state. And essentially, the geostrategic theory is that who rules Eurasia commands the heartland, who commands the heartland commands the world island, and who rules the world island commands the world. And so I think this is enough. I will stop here just to say that China is not a threat. Multipolarity is not a threat, except an ideological threat or the threat of a good example. It's a threat to the Western capitalist militarist system. The Global South is trying to build out a system based on win-win alliances, mutual development, and that goes directly against the Western-led colonial system of extraction, appropriation, and violent militarization. And so all of this is to say that the contradictions of the current imperial power have led it to move towards war as its kind of backstop or its final approach to preventing the rise of a multipolar world. And this is why we are moving towards war. This is why this moment is so extraordinarily dangerous, and it involves all the wars that are happening in this current moment. We shouldn't think of them as separate wars, but that they're all interconnected. So war with China could go nuclear. In fact, it's very, very likely to go nuclear. US declaratory policy allows the use of nuclear weapons. China is not a threat. It's a threat in the sense that a parasite sees a host's effort to free itself as a threat. And therefore, the host has to realize the way in which the parasite is attached and controlling it. And for peace, we have to work for peace. In this current moment, we're hearing a lot of absurdities, and those who tell you absurdities are preparing you for atrocities. We're at a very, very dangerous moment, and we have to all work for peace together. Thank you. I threw a lot at you, but if there are comments, questions, thoughts, I'm happy to take those on.
Well, thank you. And that was the most comprehensive treatment of this subject I have ever seen. Somebody in the chat said, I feel like I'm taking a one semester course here. So that was powerful, KJ. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for all of you, there have been a number of people who've asked for the slides. I will send the recording of this out afterwards. And
I'll prepare the slides as well. Yes, I'm happy to share. And my slides have links, so so that they can also go back to the source material as well.
Thank you so much. You'll get an email from me as a follow-up, and it'll be the recording and the slideshow. So Brian and Paul, actually, before we go to Q&A, Brian, you want to lead us in a little action here that you have prepared? As I said, we have taken up the habit of having an action every time we do a webinar, and that's simple enough to do. And Brian makes it very simple to send a letter right on the spot, right now. So Brian, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks, KJ, for that fantastic presentation. As Ken just mentioned, this tool that I just put in the chat, and we'll also send this link out to all of you in a follow-up email, will allow you to send a message to your reps. As KJ said, what did you say? It was about three anti-China bills per week?
Per
day.
Every day. Yeah. Not every one of them passes, but about 3 of them are drafted every year. I think last year there were about 1,200 anti-China bills.
So that shows the importance of pushing back against this. So this tool allows you to do just that. It allows you to send a message that you can personalize, but there is a template in there that asks your reps to stop going along with this and to put out a statement that says they do not support our path to war with China, which we are very much on, given all of the reasons that KJ just laid out. And also there's a bit of fun in there. If you click on that link, you'll see a political cartoon that was made by one of our former interns, a design student from Northeastern, who illustrated how Congress behaves on any issue and how it behaves on the issue of U.S. war with China. So that's just a little teaser to get you to click it, but takes about 30 seconds. You just put your address in there. It generates a letter. Please hound your members of Congress on this issue. Tell them that you do not support a new Cold War with China.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. And I did it while you were speaking. It doesn't even take 30 seconds. So please, if you get a chance, do that. Okay, so somebody asked KJ you can see in the chat, he just posted a link. Someone in the chat asked for that already, the Congressional Research Service. Thank you for doing that, KJ. And Paul,
and I'll also invite people to go to David Swanson's list of wars. I think that's a pretty comprehensive list of U.S. aggression. So I'll put that into the chat right now. U.S. war list. It's it's exhausting just to look at these lists, but I think we should be aware of them.
He's certainly a friend of the show. We have had him on previously, and yeah, I can't recommend him enough. I did want to also mention, because it's on all of our minds right now, it's a genocide that we're watching happen in real time. I encourage people to click here and send a message to your reps calling for a ceasefire to end this madness that we are seeing in Gaza right now, to sign on to a ceasefire now bill that has been introduced, and also to oppose future weapon sales. We saw Congress vote on this today, but due to complications, it went down to a party line vote. It's likely that they will be voting on this kind of military aid to Israel quite a bit in the near future. So that tool allows you to send a message to your reps saying that you support a ceasefire and that you oppose weapon sales to Israel. So I encourage you to take that as well, personalize it. Always, you can call these folks as well. I'll put the phone number to the congressional switchboard. Really appreciate it if you just hound them as much as possible on these issues.
Okay, good. Thank you, Brian. So we don't have a lot of time left for Q&A, but let's give ourselves 10 or 15 minutes and ask people to put questions in the chat. I did notice a couple, especially towards the end of KJ's presentations. Paul, did you see, or Brian, did you see anything that you can pose as a question for KJ?
I compiled some, yes. The first one you already answered. Will those fantastic slides be available? And I'm very glad to hear that they are. Our friend Brad Wolf from Lancaster, Pennsylvania asks, given the large military losses the US would sustain in a war with China, would there need to be some type of unique precipitating event to occur or be manufactured to gain the sufficient US public support needed for a full-scale war with China?
Yes, absolutely. You would need a precipitating event, but you have to think of the current moment as like a supersaturated solution, that it's all the elements are already in place and it would not take much. One of the events that was that helped to escalate was this notion that China is responsible for COVID. And so there's a strange paradox where people say, not always the same people, sometimes people say that COVID is a bioweapon invented by the Chinese at the same time that they criticize the US for funding this laboratory in China. Now, it's hard to wrap your mind around the idea that somehow that the United States would be funding weapons of war against the United States in China. But that's the kind of contradiction that people hold. And it shows you the sheer, when you reach that level of contradiction, you know that you're working in this complete morass of propaganda, that just anything is possible is just being thrown out against the wall. The large military losses are certain. And there are a couple of attenuating factors related to this. One is the use of proxies. As I said, there's a kind of Ukraine strategy for Taiwan Island. They want Taiwan to fight to the last person on Taiwan Island. Taiwan has increased the length of its draft threefold now. It used to be 4 months. Now it's 12 months. As I said, South Korea, whose military is under US operational control to this day, to this moment. South Korea has had a military for 70 odd years, but for almost the entirety of its time, that military has been under US operational control. And so what that means from a very practical standpoint is that the United States gets 600,000 regular troops and 3.1 reserve troops immediately to use as it will for cannon fodder. Okay. The third dimension of this, and this is very interesting, is that you see the people who were working in CNAS, who wrote the doctrine of counterinsurgency for the Afghan war. They're currently saying that we have to bring back the draft in the United States. The draft has to be brought back to the United States in some form in order for us to wage war effectively. So there are many arms of this, but all of this speaks to is the drafting of other foreign forces, the drafting of US forces, and then, just incredible escalation that all of that would entail.
You have another, Brian or Paul?
I do. I want to give Paul a chance to get in if you have a question. If not,
Well,
I think you have more.
I think the question is how, given this incredible machine coming at us, how do we begin to undermine that. I mean, within the peace movement itself, there are people that are really working hard against the war against China, and at the same time are very critical of China and what they consider its aggression and in the South China Sea, for instance. Vietnam and other countries have complained about China's activities there, and some of those complaints line up with that of the United States. So all I'm saying is, within the community of people who are desperately trying to prevent war with China, there is another orientation, namely that China itself is responsible for serious actions that antagonize the situation and violate the rights of people that it is affecting. So I just like to get your comments on this nebulous type of question.
Yeah, well, I go back to my early slides, which is that we're in a domain of information warfare. And of course, in order to wage war, which the United States wants, it has to demonize the other and to create, to manufacture consent. And that manufacturing of consent is manufactured, but it is to portray China as this existential threat to the United States. They're existential, they're threatening you in so many different ways. As I said, threat really means that they're uppity. They're uppity. They're not actually a threat. So if you look at the actual record, how many times has China gone to war? As I said, the United States has gone to war almost incessantly, right? Almost 200 interventions, military interventions from 1945 to 2001. There have been only 16 years out of its history when it has not been at war. And on the other hand, the last time China went to war was in 1979. That is 44 years it has gone without a war. And that war was with Vietnam. And those who know the history know that it lasted a few weeks. And it was actually in defense of Cambodia, because Vietnam had invaded Cambodia and was actually colonizing. It colonized Cambodia for about 10 years. And China saw Cambodia as an ally, and it saw Vietnam as a threat because it was allied with Russia. So all of these are complex geopolitical points. But the simple, very, very simple point is that China has not gone to war in 44 years. And there is no other country on the planet that I can think of that has arisen as peacefully, developed as peacefully as China. Just if you look at the other major Western powers, it's all war, colonization, slavery, primitive accumulation, just extraordinary violence. China has not done that. So then we have to talk about the South China Sea, that China is being aggressive in the South China Sea. Well, what is, China has one base in Djibouti, which is part of a UN mission, anti-piracy. Somebody pointed out the US has 800 bases. So let's look at that asymmetry and notice how much of a threat that is. China is not flying B-52 bombers or nuclear strategic bombers off the coast of California. The United States is. But let's think about the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a region which, as I pointed out, is the choke point of China. China has three vulnerabilities. One is the nose, which is South Korea. It's the bridgehead. It's the bridgehead onto the continent. It's like all invasions of China have come from Korea. It also has the chin, that's Taiwan Island. That is literally its core interest. And once again, invasions against China have always been staged from Taiwan Island. And they usually happen at the same time with Korea. That's 1592, 1895, 1950, so on and so on, and possibly 2025 or 2027. So these are the key kind of vulnerabilities. But as I said, the South China Sea is the other key vulnerability. It's China's windpipe. And there are competing claims for sea territory or economic zones in the South China Sea. These claims are distributed among 6 different countries. Every single country is contesting each other's claims. 5 out of those 6 countries have militarized islands in the South China Sea. They built airstrips and they built military, features on those islands. But for some reason, it's only China which is singled out for quote unquote militarizing the South China Sea. So you can see already the workings of massive propaganda. Now, prior to the US inserting itself into the situation, China was resolving all of its conflicts peacefully. Remember, China has 14 land borders. It has more land borders than any other country on the planet. And it has settled 13 of those land border conflicts peacefully. The only one that remains is with India. So China is working to create good relations with its neighbors. And it was also in the process of doing that in the South China Sea when the US came in and weaponized the Philippines in this fraudulent tribunal, which they didn't take to the International Court of Justice because they had no standing. And instead, they took it to a tribunal for hire. They pretend that it's in The Hague. It just has offices there. It's essentially a trial chamber that you can rent. And the Chinese did not agree to arbitration because that is their right under United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And the US went ahead and forced the arbitration through anyway. That is extraordinarily unfair, but it's also extraordinarily, it has no legal standing. So the Chinese don't uphold it. Most of the countries don't uphold it except the United States, which uses it as a legal kind of battering ram.
Thanks.
So I'll say that it seems very easy to be pessimistic about the situation, and perhaps rightly so, KJ, because we see ourselves on this path to war with China. We see our government or our legislature proposing 3 anti-China bills a day. Things are going in the wrong direction. So there's a lot of political activists on this call who are interested in nothing more than arresting that journey in the wrong direction, getting off that path, and getting on a path for peace. So before we close, I'd like to get into that a little bit. First, I would like to get your opinion on this recent news that there are going to be nuclear talks between the United States and China for the first time in many years. That news is only a day old, less than a day old, in fact. What is your take on that? What are your expectations? Is there a possibility for some strategic arms talks?
I think any dialogue is good. Any interaction, any conversation is a step in the right direction. If you recall, there was very, very little dialogue and interaction. So I think that's a good step. I will be honest, I do not expect a lot to come out of these dialogues. And as I said, the US has this kind of pattern of Jekyll and Hyde with China. That is to say, it plays good cop, bad cop. It engages in dialogue, and it will do something extraordinarily aggressive, or it will say something extraordinarily aggressive, and then it will dial down the actions. But there's a constant balancing that sums out to a constant full court press of aggression if you look at it in its totality. So I do not expect very much. At the same time, I want to emphasize that despair is not an option. The stakes are simply too high. We have to put our shoulders to the wheel and try everything humanly possible to prevent this escalation to war, as well as the current ongoing genocide in Palestine. Just on the matter of Palestine, the Chinese have been strong, ardent, and principled supporters of the Palestinian state since its inception. They used to have an embassy in Gaza. The Palestinians had an embassy in Beijing. It's been a kind of an ongoing support, and they have said, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has said, essentially, the repression of the Palestinians has to end. This cannot continue any further. They've made their position very clear in the United Nations. They've made their position very clear towards the United States. But as you see, once again, the US is continually escalating. Regarding the pessimism, we cannot give in to pessimism. We have to, well, I'm sorry to, to quote the Gramsci hackneyed phrase at you, but we have to be, even if we are pessimists of the mind, we have to be optimists of the will. And we simply cannot give ourselves into, despair. We have to take action. In fact, the best antidote to despair is action, and collective action, action with others. So connect to others, but take some kind of action. And you'll see that that is the thing that will be the most empowering and also the most significant. The other thing that we have to be very, very careful of, and I started out with a discussion of propaganda and information warfare, is that your mind is a territory of battle for the US military. I said there's air, land, and sea, but also space. That includes cyberspace, outer space, and mental space. And the government is looking to occupy and colonize everybody's mind in order to facilitate war. This is what happens in the process of war and manufacturing consent. So to resist that propaganda and to ground yourself in facts, seek truth from facts. If you hear lies about genocide in Xinjiang, go and research that, look it up and see if there's any proof, because we have uncontrovertible proof of a genocide happening in Palestine that we are being told to turn our eyes away from. And at the same time, there is absolutely nothing that could constitute genocide, which is constantly being beaten into our heads of something. So we're told to imagine who our enemies are, at the same time that we are being told to ignore the actual atrocities that are happening before us. I think a key domain of struggle is to recover your own critical thinking and to derive truth from facts.
That is so true, and that's a good place to stop, I think. Well, what an evening. Thank you for this lesson, this teaching. I feel educated, and I'm sure all of us do. I want to remind everyone, KJ just mentioned Palestine, as he did at the beginning, he did again at the end, and we did somewhere in the middle. I remind you that our very next webinar, December the 6th, is about Palestine. And it's Jeff Halper, who is a activist, a U.S. citizen, an Israeli citizen. Many years he's been involved. He lives in Jerusalem. He'll be with us from Jerusalem. And he is an activist who has been working with Palestinians for the freedom of Palestine. And he's more active now than ever. And I'm very grateful that he's going to be with us. He has a book. His book is called War Against the People. I read it when it first came out. Is why I got in touch with him to do his work with us, to come do a webinar. And it starts with the question, how does Israel get away with it? And he answers it. And his answer is because they are closely connected to the global military-industrial complex. And it's not just partners with the U.S., it's throughout the globe that the military-industrial complex we use at the web. So please join us. It's December 6th. I'll send out an email soon to all of you and to everyone on our mailing list with the recording, with KJ's slides. KJ, if you'll send them to me by email, I'll pack them away and send them out. And thank you for being with us. It's been a powerful evening, and God bless y'all. And let's keep on working for peace.
Thank you.